Good morning, everybody. Thank you for doing this all in English, because my Finnish is totally rubbish, so I appreciate you taking the effort to do it in English. We just heard about the Helsinki Region InfoShare project, which is a tangible project that is taking place here. I have been involved with open data for the past 3.5 years all over Europe, and so I will take a more generic approach and sort of talk about the things that I see in terms of barriers and solutions. But maybe first a little bit more about my background. I come from a change management and knowledge management background, and I ended up in open government data about 3.5 years ago, basically because of two reasons. One is that I think opening up government, open data is the single most exciting change process that is happening in our society right now. And I don't think it's an optional change process. I think that the disruption wave of digitalization that previously hit publishing industry and the music industry is now sort of hitting government, and that we have to renegotiate our relationship as citizens with our government, and that it also is changing the way that we work. And open data is simply a building block in that new dynamic between government and citizens. And I don't think it's optional, because there's a hollowing out of trust in public institutions, and I, as a citizen, find it very important that we have working and well-working public institutions, so it's not optional, because if we don't change, they will break down. And the second reason I'm very much interested in open data is because it's this huge resource that we don't really use. We collect all of this data for specific public tasks, and then we have that data and we let that opportunity of reuse just fall on the ground basically at this moment. And even though this is the biggest untapped resource we currently have, it's the one place where we have abundance in times of where we always talk about how scarce everything is. And this is the one abundant place we have, and we can look at the opportunities that are in there. I've done quite a bit of work in open data in the Netherlands, worked with the Home Office there, wrote the plan for the Dutch National Data Catalog, but I'm also active on the activist side, so I started a group in the Netherlands, or helped start a group called Hack the Government, where we sort of constructively provoke governments to do more. So I work on both sides of the fence, let's say, and I'm currently the community steward for the EPSI platform, which is the European Commission's website where they give an overview of all European developments around open data. If you start talking about opening up government-held information and trying to find ways of reusing that data, basically you encounter two very different groups of barriers. The first group of barriers are the ones that are being put forward to not start doing it. So this is a list of barriers that people sort of throw up as a way of, this is too difficult for me, I'm not going to change, I'm not going to do it. So these are, on that level, sort of excuses. And the one I always use as an example is, what's the business case for open data? When I started out working in a research company in the early 90s, my director asked me, so what's the business case for email? I never saw the answer, but I'm pretty sure you already sent emails today before you came here. I don't know what the business case for email is. I do know how to make the business case for effective communication between professionals in a distributed workplace. And email may not be part of that solution any longer, but it used to be that way when email was not this information deluge that it is now. So these are all things that are being thrown up as generic questions. If you don't solve all these issues for me, I will not start. But if you make it more tangible, if you start talking about actual projects, such as the Helsinki Region InfoShare project, then either these questions become answerable or they melt away as irrelevant. So this is the list where I think, okay, people don't really want to start yet, so I have to convince them of these things before. And there's a different list of obstacles, and it's also a more colorful picture. These are the actual barriers you encounter when you start to work. This little map is the result of a workshop we did in Brussels earlier this year, where we had 1.5 days of bringing people together who are working on projects like the InfoShare project and talk about the actual things they encounter when they start working with public sector bodies to open up data, or when they ask the public sector bodies to start to open up data, or when, as a citizen, they want to get access to data. And if you look at those barriers, there's different clusters in them. And the interesting bit is that basically clusters aren't about technology or whatever. So I'll go through the various clusters and give you a little bit of an overview of what's in there. The two biggest clusters are these two. And the one at the top, this one, is describing the transition process for government bodies. This is the cloud of things from, I don't really want to open up all the way to, okay, if we want to do it, it might be actually hard and I'm afraid of losing control of what people will do with my data if I release it, to, okay, we really want to do it, but how do we organize it, to, okay, we know how to do it, but who will pay for it, because the benefits of opening up my data will fall in a different place than where the costs that I'm making to open it up. So this is the transition for government, from all the sort of diffuse reasons not to do it to, okay, how do we actually do it and what's the cost of transition? And there's a similar cloud of transition questions on the outside of government. If I, as a citizen, want to use data, first I have to find access to it, which is hard. This is the biggest single barrier, still access to data. But once I get a little bit of data, I have to find ways of understanding it and finding ways of doing something worthwhile with it. Because I don't know what government has in terms of data and how it's structured and whether it's valuable or not. I can only find that out once I am able to start playing with it. And if I've played enough with it, maybe I can find viable ways of reusing the data, and maybe then I can find ways of sort of stacking new business models on top of that and find an economic way or an economically valuable way of reusing data. So this is the transition that's happening on the outside. And these two transitions are happening at the same time, and that's why it's a complicated or rather chaotic at times process, because we're learning as we're doing it. We're learning while we go along. And of course, reusing government information itself is not a new thing. This has been happening for, well, centuries most likely. But most of it was in very specific places: geographic data, meteorological data, publishing legal texts, laws, and that sort of stuff. And these are traditional industries where reuse has already taken place. And now that we're opening up government data, we are actually disrupting those existing markets, and we're disrupting existing revenue models around government data. So this is the third cloud, the third biggest cloud, and that's about that disruption. What happens to markets that are already existing, that survived on selling access to data that they had access to from the government, but others didn't? They have to find a new place where to add value in a chain, because if data becomes freely available, their business model goes away. And on the other side, if government is already selling the data, because a lot of government bodies were told in the 80s as sort of a budget cut round, you have to start selling your stuff so that you can cover your own costs. At least that was how it was in the Netherlands. If you're selling your data, then now switching to an open data model is actually very hard, because where is the replacement revenue going to come from? So it's disruptive on two sides: existing markets around reuse and existing revenue models around data. So that's the third cloud of obstacles. None of these have actually anything to do with sort of technology side of things or the legal side of things. This is all sort of around that. And these are the biggest clouds. None of it is about technology. Legal side of things is a real issue in terms of licensing, because there's this huge, basically mashup of various forms of licenses and conditions under which data is being provisioned by government bodies. Most often because singular government bodies, from their own good intentions, think we have to have some set of conditions, but we don't really know whether there's national guidelines or central guidelines, so we make up our own conditions. And for me as a citizen, that's extremely confusing, because I meet different conditions with every new government body that I talk to. There's no uniform picture there. So licensing is a pain. Somebody said in that workshop, licensing is a pain. I didn't say where it was a pain, but we can imagine. And there's various aspects to it that either the conditions are missing. It's not clear to me as a citizen whether I can even reuse this data because there's nothing specified, or it's overly restricted, or there's no general framework where I can say, okay, these are my rights as a European citizen, so that I know what to do. So this is all about licensing, and one of the interesting things there is that sort of the general notion is that people assume this is quite hard, whereas not as hard as you think, but it's also not as easy as the open data activists will have you believe. So there's a point of balance to find there. And then the only cloud of barriers that people were talking about when it came to technology was at the next level of maturity of data, which is linked data. Interlinking different databases so that if I talk about the Dutch word Bergen, which is a municipality in the Netherlands, but it's also a city in Norway, and it also means mountains, that I can interlink databases so that when I use the word Bergen, I'm sure that I'm talking about the Dutch municipality or the Norwegian city, and not so heaps of stones in the Alps. So linked data, interlinking data sets, this is where everybody was starting to talk about technological aspects, because there you need wider frameworks to aggregate and federate data sets. They weren't talking about technology on a lower level of singular data set. And then there was this tiny cloud, which is about privacy. Nobody really talked about privacy in that session, even though it's a major issue. Not for specific data sets usually per se, because most of sort of the legal frameworks in European states are pretty clear about what is public and what is not public. And that demarcation is also where open data ends. If it's public, it can be open data. If it's not public, we're done talking. And privacy sort of is part of that demarcation between public and not public. But the thing is, we've relied on privacy protection through the sort of the structures and the technical constructs that we are using. So what we didn't do in our databases is say, these are personal information fields and these are non-personal information fields. So if I want to start publishing data out of that database, how do I make the distinction between what I can and cannot publish? And also, we rely on aggregation and anonymization for publication of personal information as a way to protect privacy. But that doesn't work if we open up that huge mountain, that huge untapped abundance of data sets, because then you can triangulate. Because then you can combine various data sets that hold no personal information and still arrive at something that identifies one person. And we don't know the solution to that. We just know that we have to start figuring that out while we're doing it. So there's huge issues here, but it's usually not on the level of singular data sets or within the current legal framework. It's what happens afterwards. So this is a small cloud as a result from that workshop, but it will be getting bigger soon because we are seeing the consequences of publishing data. Currently, probably the biggest concern of people who are using, or part of the open data debate, is that privacy is being used as a way of not starting to open up data. I've been in discussions about geodata, landscapes, height lines, where people say, yeah, but we have to think about privacy first. Doesn't make any sense. Okay, so if you summarize all those clouds of barriers, I think the main issue is still access to data. There is, of course, a lot of data already out there, but it's patchwork, it's patchy, there's lots of empty spaces. So access is still the very first issue when it comes to opening up data. There's only slowly emerging a set of tools that allow us to explore what's in the data and start working with it. And as long as there's not a toolkit for average citizens to use with data, then it's also very hard to make visible what type of opportunities or what type of results you could get with data. This is like when people started building the first public libraries, not everybody could read and write, but the libraries were a vehicle to get people to learn how to read and write. And we're sort of in that situation with our toolkit now. And I forgot all about statistics as soon as I left school. I don't know about you guys, but I sort of dumped that by the wayside. So I have to relearn how to work with data if I want to do something. And if you look at what's happening with data, then a lot of it currently is finger exercises. People are exploring, let's put this data set onto a map. Let's visualize it in a very simple way. And I've seen public bodies saying, well, that's rather disappointing what they're doing with my data right now. But we're in the finger exercise stage, and there's not a lot of people who can already really play the piano with it. So it's exploring what we can do with it, trying things out, and out of that something more will emerge. And of course we're battling the general opacity of public bodies. This is the facade of the Dutch Home Office. They are in charge of government transparency in the Netherlands. This is their building. We have a long way to go, judging by the concrete structures they're in. Now, if you look at these things, these are all signs that we're still in a very much a new field. This is not established routine. We don't have yet sort of the structures and the processes that we can simply implement and follow. We are still in the explorative stage. We're learning how to do it by doing it. And so we're exploring a new field still. And that means that our main fix, our main thing we can do now to move forward is to use social scaffolding, to build relationships with people who are interested as well, with stakeholders outside of government, inside of government, and use sort of social structures as scaffolding for the places where we might have routines and procedures and simply embedded in our everyday operations. But until then, we need to use this. And this guy in the middle, he's the project leader for the Dutch National Data Catalog. The data catalog is there, but there's only 94 data sets in it. And he, of course, wants to increase that number. It's already double the number than the US data catalog started with, and they were at 250,000 data sets a year later. So there's hope for him. But he has to work on getting the data out. And one of the ways he's doing it is by publicly exposing people who give him data as heroes. So these other guys, this guy works at the Ministry for Education, and he opened up all the data about schools in the Netherlands. This guy works at the Ministry for Economics, and he opens up a lot of company data. This guy works at the Ministry for Agriculture, and this guy works in the city of Nijmegen at the Information Management Department there. And these are the guys that actually provided him with data. So what he does is he prints them t-shirts and goes with them to conferences and shows them off as the local heroes of these different government departments. I've been in a session where we had 9 people come in with USB sticks, so civil service with USB sticks, I've got data, and they were cheered and clapped and by a crowd of coders. Turning them into heroes because that will make sure that the work will continue. And this is the type of thing that we are doing because there's no operational procedures yet. It will get boring over time and it will be sort of the new normal, but until their social structures sort of are the way forward. It also means that it's hugely imperfect, and that's hard for government bodies. We don't know all the risks, we don't know all the solutions to the risks, we do know that we need to explore. And dealing with imperfection comes with dealing with this new territory and with complexity that's part of that. So we have to learn to live with imperfection. And for a lot of government tasks, we don't want government to work with imperfection. It has to work because it has to be good and all the risks have to be covered. But these are sort of new tasks where it may not apply. So, loads of clouds of barriers. Luckily in the same workshop they also talked about solutions for it. Now the difficult part of that is that I'm not really done yet with making sense of all the solutions. So they named about 100 barriers, and these are about 160 different types of solutions that they also mentioned. And I tried to start grouping them as you see, but I'm not getting there yet. And the main reason is because there's too many dimensions to all the solutions that they mention. Tim Berners-Lee, he said it has to start at the top, it has to start at the bottom, and it has to start in the middle. And that's true, but that's just one of 4 dimensions that were visible in those solutions. So yes, you need somebody at the top, some political coverage, somebody who says, okay, this is great, let's do it. And you have to have the initiatives at the bottom, grassroots activism or single civil servants that saying, all right, okay, I already published this as a PDF, I'll also add the Excel file, the CSV file. But it's also about short, middle and long term. if my current systems aren't equipped yet to easily export data, then with an eye to the long term, I have to look at when do my current IT systems expire. When I am going to replace them, I can add new procurement conditions so that the new systems will be able to do it. That's the long term. The short term is I have 12 Excel files, let's publish them now. So that's an axis. The other is that you have to do a lot of things to get from where you are now to the new normal. Until we get to the point where publishing data is just embedded routine in all our government processes, we are dealing with transition issues. How do we get from A to B? And those is a different set of questions than how will the new normal look. And there's things that are small and things that are large scale. There's a huge difference between thinking, okay, I'll add a public domain dedication to one single spreadsheet, or creating a legal framework on a European level that covers all the licensing aspects for all the government bodies on the European continent. And the complex bit of it is that we have to address all those dimensions and all those spots on those dimensions at the same time. And that's why this picture is so chaotic at the moment, because all these groups were attacking all these dimensions simultaneously. Now, there are, of course, some angles in this class of solutions. Some of them are about technical aspects, some of them are about legal aspects, and the biggest chunk is about organizational and social aspects. So let's dive into that a little bit more and start with things that probably will not work unless you do it slightly differently. If I look at what I see government bodies do when they start opening up their data, basically these are 4 typical approaches that usually fail somewhere along the line. The first thing is catering to what people tell you they need in terms of data. The problem is that none of us have a clear picture of who the reusers of government data will be. So when you start listening to specific needs of specific stakeholders, you're automatically excluding other groups of potential reusers, even if you don't know about them yet, and even though you don't really know what their reuse will look like. But if I start catering to specific companies on how they want to have the data, I'm probably excluding some grassroots group or a group of citizens that want to use the data in a completely different way. They don't want all kinds of services around it, they just want the raw data. But I'm not even aware that I'm excluding them. So catering to specific groups, well, it sounds like a good idea because I hear needs from a certain group of potential reusers and I'm going to cater them. It doesn't really work. So the solution here is to stay as close as possible to the original data source. Don't make assumptions about how people are going to be reusing data because you simply cannot predict the reuse. 5 years ago, there were no applications for mobile phones. And now you have this huge explosion of all kinds of apps, and nobody would have guessed up front what type of apps would be possible or what people would be actually using. So reuse is not predictable at this stage. We don't know. So starting to cater to specific data needs is a pitfall. What I also notice is that as soon as you talk with a public sector body about, okay, how are we going to open up our data, everybody focuses on the hardest problem, about the data that we're currently selling, where is the revenue going to come from, or what type of license will be attached to it, or the data sets that we buy from others and the conditions that come with that. The problem is that there's a huge pitfall in trying to solve the problems that you're not going to be able to solve. The public sector body that charges for its data probably does so because a higher up public sector body told them to do so. So it's not the selling public sector body that needs to solve the revenue issue, it's the one higher up. You will not solve it within your own scope. And the same goes for making up your own licenses when it comes to opening up data. It's probably not your job as a public sector body to draft your own license. And there's probably somewhere central where there's already people thinking about licenses. So there's a lot of issues that you probably don't want to solve inside your own public sector body. But you have to go to a different place to get there. All the stuff that is directly connected to your own data and to relationships with your own stakeholders, that's within your own scope of influence. But all the other stuff will just prevent you from getting anywhere, even though you're spending a lot of time and effort trying to solve those. So don't solve the wrong issues, stick to the ones that are directly within your own scope of influence, because that's where you can make progress. And the other thing that I see starting to happen now is what David Eves, he's an open government data activist in Canada, calls the compliance trap. This is about why are you opening up data? Are you doing it because somebody else wants transparency? Are you doing it because somebody else thinks it is economically interesting? Or are you doing it for your own benefit? Do you see reasons to do it for yourself, like we've heard in the previous presentation as well? This is the compliance trap, because if you're doing it for somebody else, what will happen if you get to deal with budget cuts, or if you get to deal with stresses on your own organization? Are you going to strike the open data project because it's something you didn't do for yourself? It's probably then one of the easy bits to just remove again, because there's no real sort of personal investment of the public sector body in terms of being connected to the issue. So that's a pitfall. Do not do this for somebody else. Find ways of doing it for yourself. And I think if you look at the stresses on government bodies in terms of budget and in terms of public relations, if you want to change the way you work, you will have to start using different instruments. You cannot use the same instruments and toolkit that you've used before to radically change the way that you work in certain aspects. So if you want to do things in a new way, you need new tools. And open data is just one of those new tools, so you can see it as your own instrument. And you can see that happening around the world. This is, I think, the greatest open data example worldwide at the moment, and nobody really sees it as an open data initiative. This is the International Aid Transparency Initiative. What's happening here is that international aid donor countries, such as Finland, such as the Netherlands, are opening up their data on how they spend their money on international aid. Which NGOs get funding, which projects get funding, to which countries is the money flowing. Then the NGOs who get the funding open up their data on how they spend it on projects. The receiving countries open up their budget information to show how international aid figures into their national budgets and how it complements spending on other policy sectors. And civic organizations in the receiving countries open up their data on how they are keeping track of whether these projects are succeeding or not and how they are measuring impact. So what you see here is an entire sector opening up their data bit by bit with one overriding motive, and that is making the entire sector more effective. All these donor countries see their budgets being cut and discussed. International aid is generally ineffective. All those discussions in Parliament, really nobody knows whether it's true or not. So the response is open up all the data so that we can actually see where the money flows, allow receiving countries to plan better for what's coming down the line. And there are big things to gain here. Receiving countries typically have 10% budget insecurity in their national budgets because they don't know how much aid they will be getting next year. 10% of your national budget, if you don't know whether it's coming or not, that's a big issue. They also don't know what the money will be spent on. Are the NGOs going to spend it on schools? So maybe we don't, as a receiving country, have to build schools, but build the roads to those schools. All those things are being sort of becoming more visible by opening up the data in the entire sector. And they don't themselves see this as an open data project. They look at it as aid transparency. They don't use the word open data. They weren't even aware there was an open data discussion. But it is the biggest open data project currently that I think shows how it is useful to government bodies themselves. Another interesting thing is that open data can be a way of creating new conversations with citizens. This is the most intriguing thing. There's a UK website, legislations.gov.uk, where all the UK laws are published. But they've done it in a way that you can reference with one URL specific paragraphs in specific legal text. So it's linked data, and you can link to specific sections of laws. And what's happening on Twitter is that people are using it inside their day-to-day conversations about criminal cases in the newspaper. So they're referencing specific paragraphs in UK law in their conversation about what's happening in the news. Did you see that about Scientology? Yeah, I think it's related to this paragraph in the, some sort of act. And this is weird. I don't know about you, but I don't have these type of conversations at the moment. That I'm saying, oh, did you read about that bank robbery? Oh yeah, it's connected to paragraph. Nobody does that until now. But it's becoming possible because the data's been opened up in a way that allows me to reference. This is new conversations. I think the guys in the Ministry of Justice would be quite happy with it because people are actually seeing laws not as dead material, but as something living that you can engage with. This is a new type of conversation happening. And more local, this is in my hometown. I've been trying to get my city government to open up data, even though they already adopted a quite ambitious motion in the city council. In terms of actual results, we're not getting very far yet, but we'll keep at it. But one of the things that's happening there is that the department that does all the park maintenance and maintains all the green spaces and the patches of grass at the corner of the street, they usually run out of money in September. And then you have 3 months of the year left, and then they start thinking of ways, okay, how do we complete our work this year even though we don't have any money? So every year, come September, they start talking about let's engage citizens in helping us maintain the parks and maintain the green spaces. So they start asking people, would you like to help us? And the general answer is, I don't know. As a citizen, I don't know. Because I have no clue what the maintenance department is doing in my street. Because when they come, I'm away working. And so I don't know what they're doing. I don't know how often they do it. I don't know what's needed. I don't know how much it costs the city to maintain the patch of grass at the corner of my street. And how much I would save the city if I were to cut that grass. So without the data about maintenance and maintenance rhythms and costs and expenditures, I cannot even have a sensible conversation with my government about whether I want to be part of that or not. I need to know all that first before I can judge, okay, if me and my neighbor spend an hour today cleaning up a patch of greenery in our street, and it saves the city €1,000, that might be worthwhile doing it. If it's 30 minutes of work, it's fun to do it with the neighbor, let's have a beer afterwards, But if it costs me a week of work or effort, and it saves the city €200, I'd rather they raise my taxes, because that's not a good trade-off. So in order to be able to judge if I want to be involved as a citizen, I need to know more about the actual stuff that is happening, and I need data for that. So what we have here is an opportunity to change the way we provide government services. Typically, if you look at a traditional government service like schools or hospitals, the more people use it, the less, and you want to maintain the same level of cost, the quality of service will go down. If you want to maintain the spending on schools and there's more children flowing into the schools, class sizes will increase and general level quality of education will probably go down. So that's sort of traditional. E-gov sort of tries to stop that. E-government services usually trying to get to a situation where when more people use it, the costs of service remain the same and the quality of service remain the same. If I want to apply for a new ID card, I use a form on my city's website, and even if all my neighbors do it, it's the same process and I still get my ID card and it doesn't run up new costs for the city. With open data, we get to a stage where we could do collaborative government services, where the citizens, like with the park maintenance in my city, are part of delivering the service. And what you get there is, again, this social structure that the more people actually use the service, the more valuable the service will become at the same cost. So, quick example of that would be something like this. Patient Opinion. There's a similar website in Sweden as well, I saw. This is where people using healthcare services share their experiences, good and bad, and it's connected to waiting lists and all that sort of stuff. And if more and more people use it, this is actually a good quality control system for what's happening in hospitals and in healthcare services. But it increases in value the more people use it. And if less people use it, it's just anecdotal. But if more people use it, you can do pattern hunting and see sort of over time how things are shifting. So this is a type of interaction government-citizen where if there's more citizens involved, the value increases. So, avoiding the compliance trap, doing it for yourself and not for somebody else, is basically about staying within your own sphere of influence and starting with the issues that are relevant to your own tasks, your own public tasks and your own policy topics that you're dealing with. And then look at what data is connected to it and how could releasing that data change the way that I interact with my stakeholders, with citizens. And then the fourth typical approach is, even though we've seen all these barriers about not being about technology and all these barriers not really being about sort of legal aspects but about organization and social aspects, trying to do open data and then skip the whole social side of things, simply ignore that it changes the way that you interact with people outside your organization. So skipping the social scaffolding. And then sort of becomes an internal thing for IT or information management. I've seen it happen. And then also the discussion about how is this useful to ourselves sort of dies away because all of a sudden it's an IT problem and then sort of becomes invisible and it won't get you anywhere. And even though that sort of the social part of it is the best place to start because you don't need to change government and you don't need to change society to be able to start. It just takes one civil servant or one citizen. This is again from my own city. The guy in the blue shirt was the very first civil servant inside city government that I met that was also interested in open data. And that first connection was all it took to get going in our city with opening up data. And Heinze, he was a student at the time, he was the very first coder I met in the city that was actually interested in open data. And that first connection was all it took to get reuse going in the city. And this is a couple of months later where we, in a local pub, in the city center, brought together a bunch of people with laptops and he brought a USB stick with data sets and we started working on data to show what's been possible. So it doesn't need to be a big project at the start. You need the social scaffolding to start small and start agile basically. One civil servant and one citizen interested in this is enough to get going and then explore your way forward from there. But that's different from how we're used to organizing government. That's it for as an introduction. Slides will be online later and of course reusable. So download them there and let's discuss questions and remarks. Do you also know whether there's coffee very near here so that we could do a quick?
There's actually on the other room, just going outside and if anybody wants more coffee.
10:24, so we still have, how much time?
Half an hour?
Half an hour. Let's do questions first and then move to the coffee.
Yeah,
that's probably better. Otherwise we won't return. Yes?
Are there any differences, what kind of differences are there in different European countries about this? I mean, is it mainly legal problems or any other problems in different, if you compare different countries?
I think the problems are pretty much the same everywhere, but the starting points are very different. In France, for instance, their starting point was about, not about really open data, but how can we sell as much data as we can. That's because open data ended up with the government department for the exploitation of intangible assets. These are the same guys that sell the Louvre brand to Dubai. And they were also in charge of exploiting open data. So they came up with a scheme of 72 or 74 different ways of paying for data, which was hugely complex. And then a year later the Prime Minister said, we're not going to do that anymore. If you want to charge for data, you need to have my personal permission. So they started from the exploitation standpoint. The UK came very much from a transparency starting point, so there was a lot of political pressure from the top. Public sector bodies weren't really eager to start doing it, but they were was simply demanded of them. That's now slowly coming around, where especially local councils find that it changes the way they can interact with their citizens. At a European level, it's mostly economic motives. In the Netherlands, it started from transparency efforts and e-government efforts within the Ministry of the Interior. So it's different in every country where the starting point is, but then it quickly sort of evolves into the same set of questions that everybody tries to solve. Yeah.
I would be interested to hear if any of you have had experiences in your own organization trying to open data, and if any of this rings a bell. Have you had such experiences in your organization, or are you just in the beginning to understand what this is about?
I come from University of Helsinki, and we have had scientific approaches, but the practical stuff, for example, library data or something like that, we have encountered every single one of those problems that you mentioned. And right now, the one that I'm tackling personally is that you had a good word for it, triangular conclusions or something like that. Somehow the thought of combining data from various sources is such a big issue that it is, I mean, if I can do it in my head, combining certain data and drawing conclusions from it as an IT specialist, just imagine what computers can do. And that is really, personally for me, the issue right now.
Yeah.
But yes, we're in the middle of it. Somewhat daunting, understanding is daunting, but it's difficult.
I could say, I'm from Aalto University, doing some research now about, I think that when the agencies are open to data, I think you also mentioned that the people who are using the data, that they should have the competence, and I have doing research how mature are the user organization in utilizing the public sector data, and I'm specialized in the geospatial data, so I'm doing quite a lot of research on that, and I have found also that the technical infrastructure is not anymore the problem, but the organizational issues, and also the networking issues, how you network with the strategic partners to share the information. Now also how to improve the competence of the employers who would like to use the data, and how to change their attitude that they can learn new things.
What kind of answers do you give? If there's public data which is made open, and then one of the issues that people hope is the business side, that somebody builds an application on that data. So then becomes the question of somebody making money on the public data, and then the actual provider then comes interested. Well, where's our share? So how do you answer that question?
I'm not sure whether there's already a definitive answer, but it does happen. So it happens in two ways. One is that I encounter public sector bodies who say, we don't want other people to make money over our backs, which is an interesting choice of words, but and the others are, okay, once people reuse our data economically, in an economically viable way, do we get a share? From a legal standpoint, the answer is there's no way to answer that, and in the sense that whatever happens with the data is out of the hands of the public sector body that actually publish the data. The issue there is that of course the benefits of economic activity on top of data will end up with government again in the form of taxes. The thing is that's usually the finance ministry and not the public sector body that published the data. But in the direct relationship between the PSB and the reusing company, I think there's not a whole lot you can do. And I'm also not sure whether it's a relevant question for the PSB. I understand the sentiment and I understand the emotions connected to it, but I'm not sure whether it's within the scope of what the PSB should discuss. Another angle there, and that I think is more relevant to the public sector body itself, is okay, if I am a company and I'm reusing your data, and I build my company on being dependent on having your data for my business model, what happens if your public tasks changes and you decide you don't need to collect that data anymore for yourself?
Right.
Do I, as a company, then have any claim to ask you to keep providing the data? Well, so the strict legal answer is no. But of course, am I going to start building a business on top of your data if I'm not sure whether I will have the data as a sort of continuous provision? So what you see the information industry do a lot is actually saying, okay, we understand you provide the data for free and we don't want to really pay for that because that's open data. But we are willing to pay you for a certain level of service provision. And all the costs you incur for me to be able to keep using the data in a way, or getting the data in a way that's actually interesting to me, I will be willing to pay for. You see that type of dynamic emerge. I'm not sure whether that is in the long term a viable model either, but that's what's happening right now. At the same time, companies also use that same argument. Okay, we're willing to pay for the data to close up the low end of their markets. Talked about market disruption, so geo sector, the media sector. Typically, the companies that benefit most from open data are actually small ones, so the starting ones, is at the low end of the market. It's not the established players that have any value to gain from having access to the data, because they already have the access to the data they want. And for them to be able to pay for the data actually secures the under end, the soft underbelly of their market. So it's a protection measure for them to also pay for that data. So you will hear established companies saying we are willing to pay for data because that's a way to protect their markets.
Okay, yeah, but I think that even if the agency is opening data, there should be some very simple licensing principles, so that there would not be that cases where the company doesn't know whether they must give some of the revenue to the agencies or not. It should be clear that when you start to use this in your innovation products or services, you know that.
Yeah, there's in the Netherlands, the Ministry of the Interior actually has the standpoint that they think a license is not needed because the law specifies that government has no copyright to anything unless they specifically claim it, and they do the same for database rights. So they say we don't need any licenses. That's their official standpoint. The thing is that citizens and companies still want a license as a clear signal that it's allowed to do something, because as a citizen, I'm used that even if I write something and I don't claim copyright, I still have it. If the state writes something and they don't claim copyright in the Netherlands, they don't have it. But that's a dynamic that is unfamiliar to most of the people and most of the companies, because their everyday action is in a different place. And so in the Netherlands, you see that there's a huge demand for very clear licenses, preferably one single license that covers everything. But as a clear signal, as a clear statement of this is possible and this is where possibilities end.
Yeah, I would say in addition to making the data accessible, I mean, after that I think the most important thing is the license. Yeah. And in Finland there's the Ministry of Finance working group is right now working on this open data license. They are working on basic registries. Luckily they realized that okay, there's a license need for open data. They listen to I hope to as many people as possible. For example, we've been giving them our input, and in our project in HRI in March when we launched our website, we were hoping to be able to use Creative Commons attribution 3.0, but it was never finalized on time. So we had to create our own, which we in the long run term do not want to do. But basically our license states that okay, you can use the data in pretty much whatever way you want, as long as you credit the source. Yeah. So it's in line with attribution. But that's really important, that's also in Finland, that the state, if they come up with a national license, they have as little restrictions as possible, and on a long term they would have a migration path to an international license.
Yeah, because especially the last step is interesting because if you, for instance, look at the reuse of Spanish data from the trade register and the cadastral office, about 60% of the reuse is actually outside Spain. And there it doesn't make any sense to have a Spanish license on that data because most of the reuse is in a completely different jurisdiction. And so it is important to make that step that if you have a specific license for yourself or a specific national license, that it's also clear how it connects to international frameworks of licensing, so that reusers elsewhere in Europe also understand what they can do or not do with the data. Because reuse is borderless, and of course jurisdictions aren't, but that's something we need to deal with as well.
Do you see any problem with that? Because of this borderless sharing of information, the cost of providing the data on behalf of government, it always costs. But the company which is using the data might be in some other country.
Yeah.
So the tax doesn't flow into this country.
Yeah,
the cost
that's
for
true. Yeah.
producing data.
Yeah.
So is there any discussion about this?
No, there is no discussion about that. It's sort of glossed over. So the European Commission always talks about sort of the generic economic benefit that is in open data for the EU as a whole. So they come up with these huge numbers for the single market as one entity, basically.
But the scope is also bigger than EU.
Of course, yeah. It's, and it already is now. I mean, the Dutch Meteo data used to be very closed. So all the Dutch reusers of Meteo data actually got their data for free in the USA because the same data was available there because it was supplied to NOAA by the Dutch Met Office. And that's true for a lot of other data sets as well. I was in Bulgaria in the spring and they said, well, we're never going to release this in this data set. I said, do you realize that it's already available through Eurostat and the OECD? Because they're legally obliged to provide the data there. It's being published there. So yes, reuse is not local, and that's not part of the discussion yet. Whether you want to have those benefits also reflect back on the publishing incident, I don't know. It's a can of worms by the looks of it.
Yeah.
So, but that's one of the major reasons that you have to look at how is this beneficial to my own organization in its own right. Because economic activity or transparency for somebody else is probably not enough to keep doing it, and certainly not enough to turn it into something that's actually part and parcel of your operational processes. I mentioned the Dutch Ministry for Education. They started publishing data 6 years ago because the judge told them to do it. That's not a good reason to keep doing it, you know? But right now they're already in the phase that they are designing openness, publicness into their IT architecture, and they're designing it into their function specifications for employees, so the function descriptions, because they now recognize it as something that they can do by design and have it benefit themselves. But that's a trajectory of multiple years, of course.
And one other question, that all of these arguments on behalf of open data and transparency can also be applied to corporate data.
Yes.
So
yes.
is there any discussion about...
Yes. Actually, there is movement there. Of course, the easiest way for me as a citizen to start talking about open data is to start talking with government, because you already are a stakeholder there, and you're a taxpayer. So it's an easy argument. But company data is certainly on the agenda in lots of places as well. What I see happening, and probably you have the same experience, is that companies, in light of governments opening up data, start responding with opening up complementary data sets, because it allows for new types of discussions, or it opens up new market possibilities. For a very different project, I've been in discussions, on the side of discussions with companies like Unilever, food processing company, Rabobank, farmers organizations in the Netherlands, and Ahold, which is a big grocery chain retailer. And they are all pretty eager to open up data because they see a competitive advantage in making their sectors more transparent, when it comes to trusting food sources, for instance. And so yes, it's certainly on the agenda. Yeah. Government is just the easier starting point because we all have a stake there.
It's the same thing here in Finland. I can see more and more companies, large and small, having a discussion where they are thinking what they could open and to benefit. And I mean, a good reference of, in a way, opening data is Facebook, for example. If you think why Facebook, just one example, is so successful, they're not really opening their data, but they are providing an API to their data, which is basically consists of people and their social interactions. And in a way, that helps them to scale tremendously, right? So if you take that analogy, take open data, and the companies start to think, we open our data, we get benefits of scale, and then we complement it with public data and so on. So you have like these analogies, you know, whether you think it's good or bad, but they are there. And as said, in Finland, Helsingin Sanomat, I think they've done a very good job of really starting to get their hands dirty in opening their own data, arranging these hackathons, and doing it, and even creating recommendations for their internal and external use, how to open data. And we could argument that it's not really open data, you have some commercial restrictions, but the principles are the same. So that's a really good thing. And if they do it, and if they get it to work, they always have a business in mind. If they're successful, it's very encouraging also for the government.
I saw a short overview that in the US alone there's now somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 companies that have an API to their data that you can interact with. And I think in Europe the current biggest example is Enel, which is the largest energy producer in Italy. They started opening up their data about energy production and consumption because they produce across Europe, and they started opening that up and as part of the discussion about energy saving and that sort of stuff. So that's,
There's just a comment. There was last week I noticed a little piece of news that there's this service in Finland called Reittiopas, which is tells people in Helsinki region what is the quickest way to get anywhere.
Yeah.
And that was the second most valuable internet brand inside Finland.
Yeah.
And it could be, I don't think it's based on open data, but actually exactly the kind of application that somebody could build on open data.
Exactly, and it's a good example. The Reittiopas, it's created by the public agency. It's their service.
Mm-hmm.
But in addition to that, they've opened the API to that service.
Yeah.
And the majority of the open data, mobile and other applications come accessing that API.
Right. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think that the biggest commercial success in the Netherlands in terms of reuse is the rain radar. We get a lot of rain. And it's the most crappy website you've ever seen. And it's also the most crappy mobile app you've ever seen. But everybody uses it every day. So they make a truckload of advertising revenue from it. And I think it's the single most commercially successful app that we have in the Netherlands right now. And it's extremely simple.
Was it the case that the Dutch government is going to opening up satellite data that it already
basically they killed off the entire satellite image business in one go. What they said is we're going to create a national database of satellite imagery. We're going to procure those images centrally, and then we're going to release them to the public for free. So they're currently building the database. Until now it was that every city, every province, they were procuring their own images, satellite and aerial photography. So they're now centralizing that, but at the same time they're killing the entire industry because they just buy it once and then give it to everybody. So I'm waiting to see whether that will result in any court cases. That would be interesting. what the Dutch government is doing is actually demolishing revenue models around data. Basically, there's two types of revenue you connect to data. One is asking money to register data. That's what happens when you, for instance, register your company in the trade register in the Netherlands. You pay a fee to be registered, and you have to pay that every year. And the other side of revenue models is charging for data provision. So if I want to use data or see data, I get charged for it. And the Dutch government is actually attacking on both ends. So they told the trade register they can no longer charge for registering companies, and they will be financed through general revenue from now on. And they also demolished for the cadastral office revenue models. So the basic geo data set in the Netherlands costs 50,000 euros every time you want to use it. Starting January 1st, it will be for free. What we've seen with the Dutch Met Office that actually increases reuse by a significant number, and it also brings in lots of new tax revenue. The Dutch Met Office charged 100,000 euros a year for access to their Meteo data. Now, if you want it real time, you still pay 20,000 euros because that's the cost of data provision in real time. If you want it slightly delayed, so by the time it gets to their website, which is typically 3-5 minutes later, it's for free. You can download it all. Beforehand, they sold it for 100,000, and they had 4 or 5 reusers who were actually paying for the data. There's now 50 companies reusing it. They created 100 new jobs, and in the last 6 years, they cashed 36 million euros additional tax revenue on that reuse. And that all because they skipped 400,000 in income. And that's the typical situation. If you look at what public sector bodies are actually making from data, so the maximum market size for that in the entire of Europe is about 1.5 billion euros. That's the maximum amount of sort of revenue they can get from selling data. And typically that covers far less than 1% of the actual operational costs of that public sector body. So it's also irrelevant to the PSB itself in most cases. There's only a handful of them where it's a bigger percentage, where it's 20-30% of their operational costs. And usually it's much less than 1%. Whereas the evidence is mounting that if you remove that barrier, the actual benefit is much bigger, but in a different place, of course, than where...
Like in Finland, it's estimated that the amount, the size of the market of selling public data is roughly 50 million euros. Sounds like a lot, but doesn't sound like a lot when you compare to the whole state budget.
Right.
So it's not really, it's about other issues.
Yeah.
I was wondering, could you recommend some generally helpful sources about open data?
No resources in terms of what?
I don't know, maybe guidance how an agency could get started or...
Well, I would have to say go to the Apps4Finland platform, of course, because I'm running that platform. But that would be a good starting point to search, because the Apps4Finland platform provides in English most information that comes out of all member states, and it's 8 years worth of content, all kinds of reports and guidelines that have been published, how different countries deal with licensing, project descriptions and how they started opening up things. And if you don't find the content there, you will find the names of people there that can help you further on. There is already an interesting guide in Finnish.
Yeah, are you familiar with julkinen data opas? So julkinendata.fi.
Yeah.
It's really good hands-on open data guide.
Antti Poikala is also part of the Apps4Finland platform team.
Yeah.
So he would be a good person to approach anyway, I guess.
And I would, in addition, I would say Open Knowledge Foundation.
Yeah, OKF has a lot of resources as well. The Open Knowledge Foundation has a slightly different starting point. So they start with open everything, basically, and open knowledge is sort of a subset of that, and open data is a subset of that, and open government data is a subset of that. So it's sort of a stacked perception that they have. But what they also have is a very good network of also various mailing lists both on different topics as well as on different countries. So if you want to be part of the Italian discussion, there's an Italian list, but there's also a geo list and an open economy mailing list and a bibliographic metadata mailing list, and so that's a good resource as well. There's lots of stuff out there. The problem is always finding it.
Yeah. We also try to keep up doing putting more information, examples, videos, interviews to hri.fi. Sort of very hands-on. Yeah.
How do you see the future? What's going to happen within the next 5 years?
Well, predicting the future is of course hard. I think there's what we will certainly see happening is a bigger backlash to open data, because most of the efforts now are done by, let's say, believers. So they believe in the holy grail of opening up government, and in a lot of countries there's momentum for that, and that means that sort of the criticasters are quite silent right now. But that will change, and already in the UK it is changing. For instance, they have plans for what they call the Public Data Corporation, which is a new entity where they will pool things like the Ordnance Survey, cadastral offices and Met offices, all the data providers that now charge for that data, and they want to pool those. And if you look at the PDC plans, it sounds like they want to make it easier to get access to data, but you could read the same plans as a way of actually shielding everything off. So there has been a lot of political play in there, where sort of interests that were silent until now try to influence to move to a more closed situation again. We'll see that type of backlash more. Also from existing reusing companies, because they're waking up to the fact that even though they are the ones who at a European level campaigned for opening up government data for decades, and they took governments to court and whatever, that the result now is that they are disrupting their own markets. And they will also, a number of them will also start acting in a way to sort of protect themselves from the fallout of that. Not everybody, but a number of them will be certain to do that. So I expect more of a fight. And that means that making the case why open data makes sense in terms of a public sector body's own public task is much more important in the coming years than it is now. Transparency as an argument will not be good enough.